Some of the most powerful stories in American history didn't happen in the places you'd expect, but right here in towns across upstate New York. Names like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Susan B. Anthony forced the nation to confront the gap between its ideals and its reality. This region became a crossroads of freedom, equality, and change, and today we're stepping into the places where those stories unfolded and where their impact still echoes.
Auburn, New York, home of Harriet Tubman, one of the most influential humans in American history. Right outside the New York State Equal Rights Heritage Center, we're going to check this place out today. Harriet Tubman National Historical Park, run by the National Park Service, during the winter time does not maintain hours, so we can, and they don't do tours during the winter time. So we'll check this out. We'll drive by and check out her home, and as well as, I believe, her gravesite. So come along with us here in the Finger Lakes region of New York.
Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty? That he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery?
One half of the people of this nation today are utterly powerless to blot from the statute books an unjust law, or write there a new and just one. The women, dissatisfied as they are with this form of government that enforces taxation without representation, that compels them to obey laws to which they have never given their consent, that imprisons and hangs them without a trial by a jury of their peers.
In view of this entire disfranchisement of one half the people of this country, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States.
The Thompson Memorial African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. From 1891, Harriet Tubman contributed to the development of this church here on Parker Street in Auburn. And she continued to worship here and be part of the community here until her death in 1913. And actually, the church helped her develop her home for the aged and indigent Negroes that was then purchased and created in 1896. So Harriet Tubman, after her years as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, after that had come to an end in 1859, and then she purchased the land here in Auburn. She spent the rest of her years caring for the underprivileged of all races, of all genders, of all ability levels. Just a fascinating human being. Right next to the Thompson AME Zion Church is the parsonage, where the preachers, pastors, ministers of the church would have lived, now also owned and run by the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park. This would typically be a visitor center for the park, and it's closed for the season. Will open up around Memorial Day. Right across the way, here in this residential neighborhood. Now, during Harriet Tubman's time here, these houses would not have been here. Back there is the church cemetery. The Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. After being a conductor on the Underground Railroad, being the Moses of her people from 1849 to 1859, and then settling here in Auburn, New York, worshiping at different places, just all amongst her community. Serving in the Civil War as a nurse, constantly serving her community. With the help of the Thompson AME Zion Church, constructed this building to serve a need for the elderly and disabled African Americans. An underserved need that was not being met. Harriet Tubman, truly a fascinating individual. Born in the 1820s in Maryland, Harriet Tubman had eventually fled slavery and emancipated herself. Was a conductor on the Underground Railroad from 1849 to 1859. Settled here after 10 years in Auburn, New York. She worked with the community. She helped the community during the Civil War. She served as a nurse for the Union cause. And then eventually, this house she purchased outright after raising her own funds. She purchased from the Sewards, Frances Seward, wife of William Seward, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. Also famous for Seward's Folly, the purchase of Alaska, which wasn't really a folly, but the purchase of Alaska done through William Seward. With the fugitive slave law in effect in the 1850s, Harriet Tubman would have, by law, should have been returned to Maryland, even though she had not been there for decades. But she purchased this home, and then later on, after worshiping at the Thompson AME Zion Church in the 1890s, after helping them build their structure, the church helped Harriet Tubman construct this structure. The Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, meeting the need of African American elderly and disabled health care and housing, which was just not available. Harriet Tubman truly was a wonderful human being, serving all sorts of people, no matter their race, no matter their color, no matter their situation. But she definitely looked out for her own that was underserved, even in a free northern state. Auburn, New York, Finger Lakes region of central New York, an amazing hotbed for civil rights, women's rights, civil rights, African American rights, abolitionism. We'll see more. This new headstone was erected in 1937 by the Empire State Federation of Women's Clubs. Since the original headstone was either vandalized, destroyed, stolen, broken, for some reason, this was re-erected then. Harriet Tubman Davis. Davis being Harriet Tubman's second husband. During her time in Auburn, New York, she made it a point to tell everybody that her name was Harriet Tubman Davis. Not just living off of her fame as Harriet Tubman, but that demonstrated her commitment and her faithfulness to her husband.
In the heart of Rochester, New York, we come across 25 East Main Street, this building right here. And it was here that the North Star, an anti-slavery newspaper, was published between 1847 and 1863, with other papers and journals as well, by esteemed Frederick Douglass, one of Rochester's own. He had lived in Rochester for many, many years after his escape from slavery, his self-emancipation, and leading a life of leading the abolitionist cause and the civil rights movement in greater upstate New York and in the nation as a whole. But it was here
that the North Star was published, printed, and created, driving that fuel for civil rights in America. Frederick Douglass, a fascinating human here in Rochester, New York. Though not born in Rochester, a strong abolitionist advocate, assisting with the Underground Railroad, writing, an orator, giving speeches against slavery and for all equal rights, women's rights as well. Frederick Douglass, widely considered one of Rochester's own, even though he wasn't born here. So much so that this statue was erected, the very first statue erected to an African American man in America. This one, here in Rochester, for Frederick Douglass. Here we are at Susan B. Anthony Square in Rochester, New York. Rededicated in 1994. Susan B. Anthony, one of her house, has been transformed into a museum here in Rochester. Her gravesite is also here in Rochester. Rochester is part of the Central New York region, which has prominent history in women's rights. In Seneca Falls, women's rights movement was over there. And here we have a monument of Susan B. Anthony having tea and conversing with another prominent American of equal rights pioneer, Frederick Douglass. We just finished our tour at the Susan B. Anthony Museum and House, and it was a great tour. Again, no video allowed, just photo, so I'll post those on here. But it was a great tour learning about Susan B. Anthony and her life, and this being her house. You go in through the visitor center, you go around through the backside, and then you go through the house all right here. And it talks about her development of with the women's movement, her relationships with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass, and then the development further on of the women's movement through using this as her offices and her relationships with presidents. Her arrest for voting taking place directly in this house as well, and how some of that backfired just because she had wanted the arrest to be more of a public spectacle to get into the public outcry, but then the police officers, not expecting that, didn't have those tools available, and then her her bail and payments and whatnot paid for on her behalf, which she wanted to be treated like everybody else. But this is a great place. I truly recommend that you come on down. If you're in, visit here, visit Seneca Falls for the Women's Rights National Historical Park and the Declaration of Sentiments through Elizabeth Cady Stanton as well. Right across the corner, right across the street from Elizabeth Cady Stanton Park, the very first convention for women's rights was held on this corner in 1848. And we are checking out Women's Rights National Historic Park today in Seneca Falls. The Wesleyan Chapel, home to the first convention for women's rights. One thing that's fascinating about the movement for women's suffrage, the Women's Bill of Rights and Women's Declaration of Independence, all of that, is that there were allies and opponents from both sides about the movement. There were women who were opposed to the women's movement because they feared of the social upheaval that it would cause, that a women's vote would cause. We should always remember that all movements, all groupings of people are not monolithic. There are varieties and segments amongst every group of individuals.
Years earlier, Lucretia Mott, a Quaker leader who had already earned a reputation for speaking out for the rights of slaves and women, traveled to London as a delegate to the World Anti-Slavery Convention. At the convention, Mott met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a newlywed who was there on her honeymoon with her husband Henry, also a delegate. Mott and the other women delegates caused an uproar on the convention floor. The entire first day, the men debated, not about the evils of slavery, but whether women should be permitted to participate.
I was a little confused by your letter. What did you mean by women's rights? I have just returned from a church meeting where we were given more accounts about the terrible conditions of the slaves. They have no freedom or rights. Don't women already have rights?
Much of the issues within the era of when women's rights were growing and concern in the 1840s, the 1860s, 1870s was the ideal of what true womanhood was. And not every woman met that standard. As a matter of fact, most women did not. But the social consensus of what an ideal woman would be was a particular obedient Christian wife, devoted mother and homemaker. But the white middle class mothers is basically what it boils down to. Not everybody fit that mold. So when people said we don't need women's rights because they have everything that they need, well, perhaps the upper middle class women did, but not everybody else did. The women's rights conventions in Seneca Falls and Rochester were held within 2 weeks of each other, and, as it says, were attended by many of the same people. But what seems to be different amongst these resolutions, this is a much more philosophically and theologically based resolution about the rights of women as intended by God the Creator. Whereas this in Rochester is much more of a legal and political resolution of the inability of the legal system to justify the oppression of women. Very interesting. It should always be remembered that in any of these types of conversations, there is more than a political, more than a social, more than a legal, more than a philosophical or religious aspect. There are many, many different aspects of any debate. Here in New York was also home to the Five Nations of Iroquois. And the women's rights leaders had realized that women's rights were actively in action by their Native American neighbors, and inspired by them, saw that they could recognize their dream. Cultures were different. Matrilineal culture versus a patrilineal culture. Which means to them that it is very possible it's just a cultural change. What I find also so very fascinating about the women's rights movement, things that I was not aware of, was that as much as the women and the early Republicans, the abolitionists, had fought for freedom and the rights of the African Americans, the abolitionist movement, as abolitionism grew, many in the women's rights movement agreed to include women's rights along with the African American rights. However, many of the male abolitionists had argued that that would be too much, too radical, and therefore would be problematic to even get African American freedoms if they included women's rights in the freedoms as well. So, while they fought for African American male rights, the women again were set off to the back burner. On display, 2013, a visit by President Obama to the Women's Rights National Historical Park to deliver a copy of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Restoration Act, signed and approved from 2009. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Not only is Seneca Falls, New York, the home of the Women's Rights National Historical Park, it is also home for the National Women's Hall of Fame, so we'll check that out. The National Women's Hall of Fame was established in 1969 here in Seneca Falls. The first inductions in 1973. What I love about this place, it celebrates the roles of powerful and influential women throughout history in all fields: science, literature, government, education, activism, philosophy, design, media, performing arts, sports. But it also helps to demonstrate some of the aspects of life that we thought were pioneered by men who may have taken some of their ideas, stolen some patents, received credit without giving the proper credit to the women's work. And some, such as the case of Felix Mendelssohn, the musical composer, he had written some works in his name, published some works in his name that were actually his sister's. But his sister at the time would have had incredible difficulty in getting her work seen in that day and age. As a white male, it is hard for me to say that representation matters, that it mattered for me. But for so many other individuals of any type, representation matters. Because you get to see somebody like you being able to achieve, being able to succeed. And it demonstrates the ability that all things are possible for you as well. Women of the Hall. Full bio page for everyone here who is inducted. You can also find this on their website. And I will leave their site in the description. And this is the third location of the Women's Hall of Fame. But it is currently inside of an old cotton mill. Women work here as well. This is an old 1800s cotton mill that we are currently inside of, right along the river. This mill produced socks for the Union Army in the Civil War. Continued to produce socks for sports leagues and for major clothing companies. The mill closed down in 1999, the last of New York's hosiery mills to close as production models changed. being that the Women's Hall of Fame is located inside of an old wool mill, this is pretty neat. You can take some yarn and follow along, placing on the pegs your story and see how it matches for you. This history only answers the questions that we ask. So long as we can open our minds to ask questions, we can research, we can find the answers. We can find the gaps of the questions that have been answered, that have been asked and answered, to find those who may be underrepresented. This is the inductee pillar, beginning with the 27th induction ceremony. Signatures of the inducted women. Lily Ledbetter, Gloria Allred, Sonia Sotomayor. We may not always agree with every aspect of every body. That will never happen. We can appreciate what people have done. This inductee pillar was actually similar to the goodbye pillar. This is an original pillar holding the signatures of the employees at the Seneca Knitting Mill when it closed in 1999. As a final goodbye act, they signed this pillar. When the paint chips off, the inductee pillar is also an original pillar, original to the construction of the mill in 1844. Found in the basement during rehabilitation, and then recovered to be reused. The National Women's Hall of Fame. It's a small location, but it's a fitting location here at Seneca Falls for the birthplace of the Women's Rights Convention, the Women's Rights Movement here in central New York area of Finger Lakes region, which I don't know if it's technically central New York or not. I hear conflicting reports on that. Also fitting that it's inside of a woolen mill that made hosiery, employed women from the 19th century during the time of the women's rights movement. Small location, but a powerful location. Something that people should check out if you're in the Finger Lakes region. Definitely inspirational. Just to think about people going beyond what other people or society did not think was capable or right within their rightful societal norms.
The stories of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Susan B. Anthony remind us that history isn't just something we read about, it's something we can stand inside of and celebrate. And here in upstate New York, those stories are everywhere. Hidden landmarks, small towns, places you might otherwise just pass right by. But there's so much more to explore here, so if you're planning a trip or just love discovering places that matter, be sure to check out some of our other videos from across the region. We'd love to have you along, so like and subscribe and come along with a visit with us, and we'll see you in the next one.